prosecutor walked in with 6 attorneys. James Carter walked in with 2 kids. He once pulled out of the wreckage of the world. He sat at the defendant's table, 53 years old, spine curved like a man who had carried too much for too long, hands resting flat against the wood as if bracing for impact. The suit he wore belonged to someone else. The gray at his temples did not. He kept his eyes forward, jaw set, breathing slow, the way a man breathes when he has already made peace with the worst possible outcome. Lily stood to his left, Ryan to his right. 20 years ago, they were 2 children nobody wanted. No family, no name, no future anyone was willing to claim. James Carter changed that on a quiet Wednesday morning with nothing but a signature and a choice. Now they were the only wall between him and a life sentence. And what they were about to walk into that courtroom and say, no one saw coming. James Carter was 33 years old the first time his life fell apart. His wife, Carol, had been sick for 14 months before she died. 14 months of hospital corridors and insurance calls, and nights when he would sit in the kitchen long after midnight, too tired to move, too scared to sleep. When she finally went, on a Tuesday morning in early October, with the window cracked open and the sound of rain on the street outside, James didn't cry. He just sat in the chair beside her bed and held her hand until the nurse came in and gently told him he didn't have to anymore. He went back to work the following week. There wasn't anything else to do. James had grown up the kind of man who fixed things, pipes, fittings, pressure valves. Whatever was broken, he could find where the leak was and seal it shut. But grief didn't work that way. Grief had no source, no joint he could tighten. It was just everywhere, all the time, seeping into everything. He lived alone in a small rental house on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, in a neighborhood where the houses all looked like they were tired too. He had no children, no siblings nearby. His parents were gone. The only real constant in his life after Carol died was the work, the early mornings, the drive, the weight of the toolbox, the satisfaction of a job done right. Then, one November night 2 years later, everything on his block changed in under a second. He heard the phone ring around 11 o'clock, and then he heard the sound his neighbor Sandra Collins made when she answered it, a sound he had never heard a person make before and never forgot afterward. Her husband, Dale, had lost control of the car on Interstate 70 in the rain. Both of them were gone by the time the paramedics arrived. They left behind a 7-year-old girl named Lily and a 5-year-old boy named Ryan, both of whom had been asleep at home with a babysitter when the call came in. James had known the Collins family for 3 years. He had replaced the water heater in their basement twice. Lily used to wave at him from the front porch when he pulled his truck into the driveway next door. Ryan had once handed him a toy wrench through the fence, very seriously, as if making a formal contribution to the work. In the weeks that followed the accident, James watched from a careful distance as the machinery of bureaucracy moved around those 2 children. He watched a county social worker come and go. He watched a distant uncle arrive from out of state, stand in the Collins driveway for 20 minutes, and then drive away without going inside. He watched a cousin on Sandra's side answer a phone call and then stop answering phone calls. He watched 2 small children become a problem that everyone acknowledged and no one solved. The state began preparing to place Lily and Ryan in the foster system. James drove to the Department of Job and Family Services on a Wednesday morning without telling anyone. He sat in a plastic chair in a waiting room that smelled like old coffee and filled out paperwork, and thought about Carol, who had always wanted children, and who had always said the best thing a person could do was show up when no one else would. A woman across the desk explained the process to him, the background checks, the home study, the timeline, the requirements. She seemed surprised that he was there at all. He listened to everything she said. Then he asked for the forms. He was not a perfect candidate by any reasonable measure. He was a single man with a modest income and a rented house and a job that started before sunrise most mornings. He had no experience raising children. He did not know how to cook much beyond eggs and sandwiches. He had never thought of himself as someone's father. He signed the forms anyway. It took 4 months and 2 home visits and more paperwork than he had ever touched in his life. But on a cold Thursday in February, James Carter brought Lily and Ryan Collins home. Lily carried a pink backpack with a broken zipper. Ryan carried a stuffed rabbit missing one ear. They stood in the doorway of his small house and looked around at the plain walls and the worn carpet, and the kitchen where a single man had been eating dinner alone for 2 years. And James looked back at them and understood, in a way that required no words at all, that his life had just permanently changed direction. He had not been asked to do this. No one had called him. No one had suggested it, or nudged him toward it, or told him it was the right thing. He had simply seen 2 children that the world had decided to leave behind, and he had walked through a door. That was the kind of man James Carter was. It would take 20 years, and a courtroom in downtown Columbus, for anyone outside that small house to understand it. The first year was the hardest, and also, in a way James would only recognize much later, the most quietly beautiful. He did not know how to tuck a child in properly. He did not know that Lily needed her nightlight left on at a specific angle, or that Ryan could only fall asleep if someone was in the room. He did not know that a 7-year-old's grief and a 5-year-old's grief look almost nothing alike, that Lily went very still and very polite when she was hurting, and that Ryan cried loudly and without warning and then forgot about it entirely, and that both of these things were completely normal, and both of them broke his heart in separate ways every single time. He learned by watching. He learned by asking the pediatrician questions that he wrote down on a notepad beforehand so he wouldn't forget them. He learned by calling a woman at the county office named Margaret, who had handled their case, at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night to ask whether it was normal for a 5-year-old to refuse to eat anything that was touching something else on the plate. Margaret told him it was. He thanked her and hung up and stood in the kitchen staring at the stove for a long moment, then reorganized Ryan's dinner into 3 separate bowls. Lily's hair was the thing that worried him most in those early months. Carol had always worn her hair short, and James had no frame of reference whatsoever for long hair on a little girl. The braids, the tangles, the way Lily would come downstairs in the morning looking like she'd been through something catastrophic. He bought a book. It didn't help much. So he found tutorial videos online, watching them on his phone in the kitchen after the kids were in bed, a cup of coffee going cold beside him, practicing the motions on a throw pillow until his hands understood what his eyes were seeing. He was never very good at it, but Lily never complained. She would sit on the step stool in the bathroom and hold still, and sometimes hum to herself while he worked through the braid, and those mornings, clumsy and slow and quiet, became, without either of them planning it, one of the fixed points of the week. Ryan's nightmares came on Thursdays mostly. James never figured out why Thursdays, but he came to expect them. The sound of Ryan's feet on the hallway floor, the small shape appearing in the bedroom doorway, the way the boy never asked to come in, just stood there waiting to be told it was okay. James would pull back the blanket on Carol's side of the bed, and Ryan would climb in without a word and be asleep again in minutes. James would lie awake for a while longer, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of the boy breathing beside him, and feel something shift in his chest that he didn't have a name for at first. It took him 2 years to recognize it as belonging. He never made much money. He was careful with what he had, the way people who grow up without excess learn to be, precise, unhurried, unsentimental about things that weren't worth being sentimental about. He drove the same work truck for 11 years. He ate lunch at the job site most days. He didn't vacation, or drink, or spend money on things he couldn't justify. Every dollar he didn't need for the house went into envelopes in the kitchen drawer, labeled in his handwriting. Lily College, Ryan College, emergencies. When Lily was accepted into a nursing program at Ohio State, the tuition cost more than the envelopes held. James sat at the kitchen table for 3 evenings running the numbers, and then, on the 4th evening, he made a call. Carol's car, the one he had kept in the garage for 5 years because he couldn't bring himself to sell it, the last thing she had touched that still smelled faintly like her, went to a man in Westerville for $9,000 on a Saturday morning. James rode the bus home. He didn't tell either of the kids what he had sold or why. He just handed Lily the envelope 2 weeks before her first semester started and told her it was for whatever she needed. She asked where it came from. He told her he had been saving. Ryan had gone to college on an academic scholarship that covered tuition, but not living expenses. Law school was a different weight entirely. 3 years of tuition, books, bar exam fees, a city apartment on a student budget. The shortfall required 3 years of James working double shifts, the regular daytime hours plus evening call jobs that took him out after dinner 2 or 3 nights a week. He told both kids that the work had picked up and that he liked staying busy. He had always been a convincing liar about things that required no one to be deceived except himself. Ryan, who was perceptive in the way that children who have lost things early tend to be perceptive, noticed that his father was tired. James told him that older men got tired more easily. Ryan accepted this and went back to his books. The day Lily graduated from her nursing program, James wore the only dress shirt he owned, white, ironed badly, and sat in the 2nd row of the auditorium because a man he didn't know was already in the 1st row, and he hadn't wanted to ask him to move. When Lily crossed the stage and accepted her diploma, she found him in the crowd immediately, the way she always had, and held up the rolled certificate in both hands like an offering. James pressed his lips together and nodded, the way he did when he was trying to keep something in. It didn't work. He cried without covering his face, sitting very straight in the auditorium seat, because crying while sitting straight felt less like falling apart than the alternative. Ryan's law school graduation came 3 years later, on a June morning so bright it made the campus look like a painting. Ryan had finished in the top 10% of his class, a fact that the program printed in the ceremony pamphlet, and that James read 4 times on the bus ride home. Ryan had started college a year early, at 17, driven by an urgency that James suspected had something to do with not wanting to waste the investment James had made in him, though Ryan had never said so, and James had never asked. By the time of the trial, Ryan was 25 years old and had been a licensed attorney for just over a year, working at a small civil litigation firm in Columbus. He was the youngest associate they had hired in a decade. They had both grown into people that James was quietly and completely in awe of, not because of the degrees or the titles, but because of the way they moved through the world. Steady, careful, unafraid of hard things. He had not given them that, he always insisted to himself. They had come to him already carrying it, already made of it. All he had done was make sure nothing got in the way. He was wrong about that, but he was the kind of man who would never be persuaded otherwise, so no one tried. The 3 of them had dinner together every Sunday night, rotating between their apartments and the house on the east side that James still rented, a little more worn now but familiar in the way that only places where important things have happened can be. They talked about cases and patients and pipe fittings and 1,000 inconsequential things, and it was the easiest James ever felt in those hours, the closest to the version of himself that he thought Carol would have recognized. He was 53 years old. He had 2 children who weren't his by blood, and a house that wasn't his by deed, and a life that wasn't what he had planned, not even close. He had never once described any of this as a sacrifice. On the last Sunday before everything changed, Ryan brought a bottle of wine, and Lily made pasta, and they sat around the kitchen table until nearly 11 o'clock, talking about nothing important. When they finally stood to go, James walked them both to the door and stood on the porch while their cars disappeared down the street. The night was warm and still. He stood there longer than he needed to. He didn't know then that it was the last ordinary Sunday any of them would have for a very long time. The construction site occupied half a city block in downtown Columbus, a skeleton of steel and poured concrete that would eventually become a mixed-use tower. Retail on the lower floors, condominiums above, the kind of development that went up fast in neighborhoods where land was newly expensive. James had been contracted to rough in the plumbing on the lower mechanical floors, standard commercial work, the kind of job he had done 100 times. Tony Brennan was 24 years old and had been working construction for 3 years. He was on the 4th floor scaffolding on a Thursday afternoon in late September when the rigging gave way. He fell before anyone nearby had time to process what was happening. James was on the 2nd floor when he heard it. A crash of metal, and then a sound he could not afterward describe with any precision, only that it was wrong in a way that registered in the body before the mind caught up. He was at the base of the scaffolding in under a minute. Tony was already unconscious. He did not regain consciousness. The ambulance arrived 11 minutes after the call. Tony Brennan was pronounced dead at the hospital at 4:47 in the afternoon. James gave his statement to the site foreman, and then to the OSHA inspector, and then to a Columbus police detective who arrived later that evening. He described what he had heard, what he had seen when he reached the base of the scaffolding, what he had done in the minutes before the paramedics took over. He answered every question. He did not consult a lawyer, because it had not occurred to him that he needed one. He was wrong about that. District Attorney Gerald Mercer had been building his campaign for state senate for the better part of a year, and he needed exactly what the Brennan case appeared to offer: a clean villain and a clear story. A young worker dead on a downtown job site, a subcontractor who had been physically present in the building, a grieving family. Mercer held a press conference 8 days after Tony's death and announced that his office was pursuing a criminal negligence charge against James Carter, alleging that James had failed to report known safety violations on the site, violations that, Mercer argued, had directly contributed to the failure of the scaffolding. The charge carried a maximum sentence of life in prison. James heard about the press conference from a co-worker who called him on a Friday afternoon. He sat in his kitchen, the same kitchen where he had watched tutorial videos on how to braid a 7-year-old's hair, where he had written out Ryan's study schedule on a piece of graph paper, where 20 years of Sunday dinners had happened, and he held the phone against his ear and listened and said very little. That night, he called both of his children and told them what was happening. He kept his voice steady and his sentences short. When Lily asked what they could do, he told her that she had already done enough, that both of them had already done more than enough, and that he was not going to let either of them spend money they didn't have on a problem that was his alone to deal with. When Ryan pointed out that as a practicing attorney, he had some standing to be involved, James told him that being a lawyer didn't mean he had to be his father's lawyer, and that he wanted him as far from this as possible. He said goodnight to both of them and hung up. He did not sleep that night. He sat in the kitchen until the sky outside went from black to gray to a pale, reluctant blue, and he thought about Carol, and about the Collins house next door, and about the look on a 5-year-old boy's face when someone handed him back a stuffed rabbit with a missing ear and told him that it was going to be okay. He thought about whether he had been telling the truth. In the morning, he called the only attorney he could afford and began to understand, for the first time, how badly outmatched he was. Gerald Mercer's office had resources, momentum, and a political reason to win. The attorney James retained was competent, but stretched thin, carrying a caseload that left her limited hours each week to devote to any individual file. The narrative that Mercer had already established in the press irresponsible subcontractor, preventable death, was clean and easy to repeat, and the press repeated it. James Carter's name appeared in the Columbus Dispatch 3 times in the first 2 weeks. The tone was not kind. James read the articles and said nothing to anyone about them. What he did not know, what no one knew yet, including Mercer, was that somewhere in the documentation trail for that construction site, there was a paper record that told a completely different story. A story about who had actually been responsible for the condition of that scaffolding. A story about when certain safety inspections had been filed, and by whom, and whether the signatures on those reports matched the dates printed above them. No one had looked closely enough at those records yet. Ryan Carter was about to look very closely. Lily called Ryan at 6:45 on a Saturday morning, 3 days after their father's call. She had spent those 3 days doing what she did when she was frightened, which was work. Double shifts at the hospital, back to back, moving fast through the corridors with the particular efficiency of someone who needs to stay in motion. But on Friday night, she had come home and sat in her apartment and done the math, and the math told her one thing with complete clarity. Their father was going to lose. Ryan already knew it. He had been pulling apart every publicly available document related to the case since the night James called, working at the small desk in his apartment, with 3 browser windows open and a legal pad covered in notes. He had called a senior colleague at his firm who specialized in OSHA litigation and asked for a read on the regulatory framework, describing it as a hypothetical. The picture it produced was not good. Mercer's team was disciplined and well-funded and had shaped the evidentiary narrative before the defense had even retained qualified counsel. Lily asked him what it would take. He told her. She told him she had been saving for 4 years. Not for anything specific, just saving. The way James had always saved, as if thrift were a kind of faith. She had enough to retain a private defense attorney, not a famous one. Not someone from a white shoe firm with a television presence, but someone competent and hungry and not overloaded. She called Nora Hayes that same morning. Nora Hayes had been practicing criminal defense for 11 years out of a small office on High Street, and she had a reputation in Columbus legal circles for being the attorney that prosecutors disliked facing, not because she was theatrical, but because she was thorough. She returned Lily's call within 2 hours. She listened to the outline of the case for 20 minutes without interrupting. Then she said she would take it, and she named her rate, and Lily said yes before she finished the sentence. While Nora began building the defense from the formal evidentiary record, Ryan went in a different direction. He started with the scaffolding inspection reports, specifically the ones that Mercer's office had entered into the record as evidence of James's negligence. Ryan was not an OSHA specialist, but he was methodical, and what he was looking for was not technical expertise. He was looking for inconsistency. He had learned early in his short career that durable lies require coordination to sustain, and that coordination always leaves marks if you look carefully enough at the edges. The inspection reports for the construction site had been filed in quarterly intervals by a company called Pinnacle Safety Associates, contracted by the site's developer, a firm called Stratton Building Group. The reports were thorough, detailed, and professional. They were also, Ryan determined after 40 hours of cross-referencing digital metadata and physical filing timestamps, partially fabricated. The final 2 quarterly reports, covering the 6 months immediately preceding Tony Brennan's death, had been submitted with backdated signatures. The physical inspection logs that should have corresponded to those reports either did not exist or had been replaced with documents created after the fact. Someone at Pinnacle had signed off on safety conditions they had never actually verified, and someone at Stratton Building Group had allowed it, possibly encouraged it, possibly directed it. Ryan sat back in his chair at 2 in the morning and looked at what he had assembled. Then he looked at the donor disclosures from Gerald Mercer's Senate campaign, which were public record. Stratton Building Group's principal partner had contributed $40,000 to Mercer's campaign over the preceding 18 months. The contribution was legal. The timing was, in the context of everything else Ryan was now looking at, extraordinarily interesting. He called Nora Hayes at 7 the next morning and laid out everything he had found. She listened without speaking, and when he finished, she said, "Send me every document." He sent everything. She spent the next 72 hours verifying his work with her own investigator and a forensic document consultant she trusted. The consultant confirmed the backdating on the inspection reports. The investigator confirmed the financial relationship between Stratton's principal and Mercer's campaign. The picture was not a coincidence. The picture was a decision. What none of them had anticipated was what happened when they brought this information to a person they had not expected to reach. Patricia Brennan had spent the week since her son's death in a state of grief so total that it had reorganized itself into fury, the way grief sometimes does when a person needs somewhere to put it. She had attended Mercer's press conference. She had believed what she was told. James Carter's name had become, in her mind, the name of the person responsible for the hole in her world where her son used to be. Ryan had debated whether to approach her at all. It was Nora who made the call. She tracked down Patricia Brennan through the victim services coordinator assigned to the case and asked for a meeting. Patricia agreed because she thought it would give her an opportunity to say directly to someone connected with James Carter exactly what she thought of him. Instead, Nora placed the documentation on the table in front of her, piece by piece, and explained what it showed in plain language. Her son had died because the scaffolding he was standing on had not been properly inspected. The company responsible for those inspections had falsified the records. The man who had been charged with responsibility for Tony's death had been on the second floor of that building and had no authority over the scaffolding's maintenance or certification. The prosecutor pursuing that charge had received significant financial support from the company, whose negligence had actually contributed to Tony's death. Patricia Brennan looked at the documents for a long time. She asked questions. Nora answered them. Ryan answered the ones that required technical explanation. When Patricia finally spoke at length, her voice was different than it had been when she walked in. Something had gone out of it. Not the grief, not the loss, but the anger that had been pointing in the wrong direction. She told them she would testify. The trial lasted 4 days. Mercer's team opened with the performance they had been building toward for months. 6 attorneys behind the prosecution table, organized, polished, and constructed around a simple emotional premise. A young man was dead, and someone in that building was responsible. They called the site foreman. They called an OSHA compliance officer. They called a structural engineer who testified about industry safety standards and subcontractor responsibility. The framework they built was not dishonest exactly. It simply arranged true facts in a configuration that left James Carter at the center of a story he had not written. Nora Hayes let them build it. She cross-examined carefully, surgically, planting small seeds of doubt without overplaying her hand. She was saving her architecture for later. On the morning of the 3rd day, Lily Carter took the witness stand. She was wearing her hospital ID badge on the lapel of her jacket. Ryan had told her she didn't need to wear it, that it might seem calculated. She told him that it was who she was, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Judge Margaret Williams asked her to state her relationship to the defendant. Lily said that James Carter was her father. The judge asked her to clarify. She had a different surname in the records. Lily said that she had been born Lily Collins, that she had been 7 years old when her parents died in a car accident, that James Carter had been their neighbor, and that he had shown up at the County Family Services office on a Wednesday morning and asked to take her and her younger brother home. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without sentimentality, looking at whoever she was speaking to. But her hands were flat on the railing of the witness box, pressing down, and James, watching from the defendant's table, recognized the gesture. It was the same thing she had done as a 7-year-old when she was trying very hard not to cry in front of someone. Nora asked her to describe the kind of person her father was. Lily thought about it for a moment, not performing hesitation, but actually considering, as if the question deserved precision. Then she said, "He was the kind of person who never left. Not when things were hard, not when it cost him something, not when no one would have blamed him for stepping back." She had watched him work double shifts for years without complaining. She had found out, only after the fact, that he had sold the last thing he had left of her adoptive mother to pay for her first year of nursing school. She said, "The man you are describing in this courtroom, a man who ignored a problem and walked away from it, is not a man I have ever met." The courtroom was quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when everyone in them is working to control their own reaction. Mercer's attorney cross-examined her for 12 minutes and accomplished very little. She answered every question with the same measured steadiness, and the attorney eventually sat down. Ryan took the stand that afternoon. Before he began, Nora addressed the court directly, establishing for the record that Ryan Carter was appearing as a fact witness, a private individual who had independently obtained and analyzed documentation relevant to the case, and not as legal counsel. Judge Williams acknowledged this and instructed the jury accordingly. Ryan had spent the previous evening reviewing everything one final time, alone at his desk, the way he had done every night for the past 6 weeks. He walked the court through the inspection report disclosures in sequence, methodically, the way he had organized them on his legal pad weeks before. He explained what the documents showed. He explained what the metadata showed. He explained, in terms that required no specialized knowledge to follow, that the safety certification records for the 4th floor scaffolding had been signed by an inspector who had not visited the site on the dates indicated, a fact confirmed by the inspector's own employment records, which placed him in a different county on 2 of the 3 relevant dates. He explained the financial relationship between Stratton Building Group's principal partner and Gerald Mercer's Senate campaign. He was careful to characterize it accurately. He did not call it a bribe. He did not call it corruption. He called it a documented financial relationship and let the jury draw the line between what they were looking at and what it meant. Mercer's lead attorney objected 4 times during Ryan's testimony. Judge Williams sustained 2 of the objections and overruled 2. She was watching Ryan with an expression that those in the gallery who knew her recognized as unusual. She looked like someone who was listening, fully, without having already decided. Then Patricia Brennan took the stand. She was 61 years old, and she walked to the witness box the way people walk when they are carrying something they cannot put down. She settled into the seat and folded her hands in her lap and looked across the courtroom at James Carter for a long moment before looking back at Nora. She said that she had come to that courtroom weeks earlier, believing that the man at the defendant's table was responsible for her son's death. She said she had been wrong. She said that what she now understood, what the documents and the testimony had made clear, was that her son had gone to work that morning and climbed onto a structure that had been certified as safe by people who had not done their job, protected by a chain of authority that had failed him at every level. She said that holding James Carter responsible for that was a lie, and that she was not willing to participate in it. Her voice did not break. It came very close once, in the middle of a sentence, but she steadied it and finished what she was saying. James Carter, sitting at the defendant's table, watched Patricia Brennan defend him in a courtroom. He had his hands pressed flat against the wood, the same posture he'd held since the first morning of the trial. His jaw was tight. His eyes were bright with something he did not try to contain or explain. He looked like a man who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time and had just felt, for the first time, someone else's hands on it. He did not look away from her until she stepped down from the stand. Judge Margaret Williams read the verdict on a Friday morning. Not guilty. The words landed in the courtroom, and then the room changed. Not with noise, not with the kind of eruption that trials produce in movies, but with a collective exhale, the sound of a breath that a room full of people had been holding for 4 days. Lily's hand found James's forearm across the table. Ryan sat very still. Gerald Mercer left the courtroom without speaking to the press. Within 3 weeks, the Ohio Attorney General's office had opened an investigation into his conduct regarding the withholding of exculpatory evidence. Stratton Building Group's principal partner was charged with criminal violations of occupational safety statutes. Pinnacle Safety Associates surrendered its operating license. The investigation expanded. It moved slowly, the way investigations into powerful people always do. But it moved. None of that was what James Carter thought about when he walked out of the courthouse. The morning was sharp and bright, the kind of October day that Columbus occasionally produces, as if by accident. Blue sky, cool air, the smell of leaves. James stood at the top of the courthouse steps and looked out at the street below. The city was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, unhurried. Buses and cars and people walking fast with their heads down. Lily put her arm around him from the left. Ryan from the right. The three of them stood there without moving for a moment. That was longer than it needed to be for any practical reason, and shorter than any of them wanted. James looked straight ahead. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the standing didn't already say better. Later, in the parking lot, Ryan would try to apologize for going against his father's wishes, for inserting himself into the case, for the weeks of digging through documents without asking permission. James would look at him for a moment, and then shake his head once, and that would be the end of the conversation. Lily would go back to her shift at the hospital that Sunday. Ryan would return to his firm on Monday. James would take a week off, and then call his service coordinator and ask what jobs were pending. Life does not restructure itself gracefully around the things that happen inside it. It simply continues, and you continue inside it. But something had shifted, something that didn't have a precise name. The thing that happens when a debt that was never acknowledged and never asked for gets paid anyway, in full, by people who didn't have to pay it. James Carter had never called himself a good father. He deflected the word, changed the subject, said he had just done what anyone would do. He had been saying that for 20 years, and for 20 years the two people who knew him best had understood that it wasn't false modesty. He genuinely believed it. He genuinely could not see, from inside his own life, what it had cost and what it had made. Lily and Ryan could see it. They had always been able to see it. On the steps of that courthouse in the October light, with the city moving around them and nothing left to prove, they stood on either side of him and held on. That was all. That was everything.